Hello, I am Professor Kristofer Allerfeldt. I'm Associate Professor in US History at the University of Exeter. And I'm going to talk you through the history course at the University of Exeter's Penryn campus. Now, you've already got an offer for this course, so much of it will be recapping really things that you already know. But what I'm trying to do is persuade you that we are the place that you must come rather than those other rather pale competitors that we have. So here's the hard sell. We are currently, I think, number 6 in the Complete University Guide 2021, and we also appear fairly high up in the top 50 world subject rankings. So what you're looking at is a major player. That, in many cases, should be enough to persuade you to come here, but in case it's not, let's think about what other things you actually gain by studying at Exeter's Penryn campus. This is not your usual top 10 university campus. It's much smaller. It's much more arty, perhaps, than many of the other history departments. We share this campus, as you may well know, with Falmouth University, which is essentially an art college. We are very different in many ways from many of the other competitors that we have. We are similar to them in the fact that all of our teaching is based on our own research. For example, I research the Ku Klux Klan, and I'm currently writing a history of the Ku Klux Klan. That will, I hope, become the main text that is used on the study of that organisation from now onwards. We are also perhaps different in many ways because we are interdisciplinary, and that is a very central part of what we do. You may well come here to study history and politics. You may well study history and English. These are central to the very way in which the department works. We have very high levels of interdisciplinary activities. Our humanities courses will become absolutely central and groundbreaking. I mean, they're very different from many other university departments. What's more, this is a new campus. Now, we could argue the merits and evils of modern architecture. That's not particularly what I want to do at the moment, but I dare say one day, when you come here, we can discuss that. But what we are is state of the art. And this state of the art extends to the way in which the library, which maybe you've had a look at already, seems very small, but it is incredibly based on electronic text, which is definitely the way the humanities are going. And that enables us to punch way above our weight, in terms of the resources that we can actually offer. But tied in with that state of the art is very much a sense of history in the surrounding area. I mean, this is the heartland of the Celtic world, and we are positioned in one of the most beautiful counties in Britain, which is shown by the fact that everyone seems to want to live here at the moment. But if you look at Cornwall as a place to study, how could you choose a better place? Perfect beaches, perfect coastline, sailing, surfing, you name it, we've got it here. Perhaps one of the things that you ought to be thinking about is, where will you go with your degree? What doors will it open? How useful is a history degree? Well, in terms of destinations for graduates, there's pretty well anything you want to do. I mean, I have had students that I've taught go on to become airline pilots, medical doctors. I've had one student, very impressive student, go to China and she worked as in senior management of a major city. And not only was she the first European to work in this field, but she was also the first woman. So very impressive range of occupations, aside from the ones that are listed here. Many students go into politics, many go into law. These are just standard things that you do with a history degree in many cases. It's possible to look at a history degree as a degree in analysis of raw data. If you think about it, historians take raw data, which is archival information, and turn that into a coherent, intelligible, intelligent argument about what that data really tells us, about what that data tells us about the past. So if you look at what use a history degree is, well, what better possible training could you have than how to analyze raw data? Today's world is full of that. So it's hardly really surprising that our graduate destinations are so diverse in terms of both jobs. If you look at the list that's there, it's pretty impressive. But also have a look at the further study. I was just talking to a student this morning. I said to her, "What do you think you're doing?" She said, "Well, I want to go on to become an environmental lawyer." We have very, very strong track record in terms of producing lawyers, in terms of producing people who go on into further studies. I mean, I have every year several students who go on to PhD programs. So we prepare for all sorts of different lives, really. How will you learn in the history department at Penryn? Well, you will normally have a weekly lecture and a couple of seminars, perhaps. A lecture is normally the entire cohort of the module that you're studying, so it could be anything up to 70 people studying in or listening to a lecture being given in a lecture theatre. These tend to be an hour, though sometimes can be 2 hours long, and they often have time for questions at the end of them. Alongside the lectures, we will have seminars. Seminars are compulsory, and they will consist of an hour, maybe 2 hours of discussion around topics that have already been set. Mine, I tend to structure fairly formally, which means that I will set particular questions for my students, which I expect them to present on either individually or in groups. Alongside these are less formal structures that we use to teach with. There are formal and informal study groups organised by the tutor and sometimes by the students themselves. Of course, this being the 21st century, much of this is reliant on web-based learning, particularly during the pandemic. So, how are you assessed on the work that you have done? Well, there is on all courses some form of coursework. That may well be summative, in which case it actually counts towards your degree, or formative, in which case it is just an exercise really to get you to understand what's required. This coursework will be normally in the shape of essays, but that's not uniquely essays. It may well be a source commentary. It could be a research exercise. And more often we are getting our students to present either in groups or individually, and these can well be assessed presentations. Now, we do this really because we're very keen on making sure that our students not only understand the subjects that they have been studying, but also that they can communicate that understanding. Now, an essay is one way of communicating that, but it is extremely important in the modern world to be able to present on these particular skills that you've gained. These study skills are a central part of what we teach at Penryn. We teach you not just history, but how to study effectively, how to put that learning that you have across clearly. Of course, the main difference between university and school is the fact that we are research-led. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that the people who will be teaching you at Exeter will be people who are experts in their subject. They will be internationally respected. That's why we are one of the top research universities in the country. And they will also be studying those subjects all the time while they're teaching you. The research and publication that these tutors will give you will be fundamentally cutting edge. We essentially write the books that others read on the topics that we are specialists in. So enough about how you will study, but perhaps what you're interested in more is what you might study. Well, one of the things that we've found when we have students coming from school is that you're brilliant on various aspects of history, but you tend to be rather focused on, I don't know, maybe Hitler, Stalin, perhaps even civil rights, maybe the slave trade, maybe imperialism. And what we want to do is give you, we don't want to knock those things out of you. Those are all very, very important subjects, obviously. But what we would like to do is to be able to broaden your historical horizons from that. And we have a wide range of topics that we teach, surprisingly wide range for a small department. We cover from the early modern period, so from the 15th and 16th century, right through to the present day. And we teach topics that we feel are relevant to the world that we live in. For example, one of my colleagues is a historian of the environment. We have economic historians. Personally, I teach a lot on race. I also teach on crime. I have a colleague. We have a colleague, Richard Noakes, who's a historian of science. We have historians of imperialism. But it's not just those subjects that are diverse. It's also the areas of the world that we cover. Personally, I work on the United States. A colleague of mine works on Canada. We have specialisms in Australia, Britain, Middle East, and historians of Cornwall as well. But these are only some of the things that we study. I mean, even though I'm a historian of the United States, I cover quite a lot of Chinese history. I cover quite a lot of Italian history. So, it's not just that. It's the interactions, perhaps, that are just as important. But should you decide that you have a burning desire to study something that is actually outside the history department, it is possible that you can do 30 credits of your degree in another subject. So it could well be mathematics. I mean, I'm currently working with a graduate student of mine on mathematics and history. So you think, well, how on earth do you actually tie those two things together? Well, what we've done is we've looked at the ideas behind artificial intelligence and the mathematics of artificial intelligence and probability and these ideas, and tied them in with the history of exploitation and privacy and particularly artificial intelligence in terms of how it might enslave us. So, I mean, there are huge possibilities in terms of what you can study. I had a fantastic student who came from the geography department to do his dissertation on the space race. So, the possibilities are almost endless, really. So what will studying for your history degree look like? Just a quick overview of the 3 years that you will spend studying at Penryn. Full-time undergraduates have to take a total of 120 credits each year. Modules are either 15 or 30 credits long, and in first year, some elements of the course are actually compulsory, others are optional. If we look at those compulsory ones, the first one is the Foundations in European History, which is really looking at how history is interpreted, how ideas behind the major trends in European history. We then have compulsory modules in public history. One of the major differences between our history department and many others is that we've always had a public historian, public history being how do we consume history, what is driving decisions between what goes into a museum and what's left out of a museum. Why is it that we have fixations with certain topics and not with others? So there is a course running that is compulsory across both terms, looking at the idea of public history. We also have people's history, which is really the ideas of history from the bottom up. So looking at how the importance of the family, the village, the individual on historical theory, which is often forgotten. Often we look at the big picture and we forget about the influence and the impact on individuals. And the final compulsory element of this is the craft of writing, where students are encouraged to write creatively, to break bad habits, perhaps we could say. But this is really looking at how can historians improve the way in which they communicate. A vitally important thing. I mean, there's no point in doing the best historical research in the world if no one actually ever looks at that. Optional modules are slightly different. World history is this, as I said before, you come to Penryn, brilliant on imperialism and Stalin, and maybe fascism or all these things. But there are other elements that perhaps you've never really had any chance to study. Looking at global trends, so looking at the idea of the world as a whole, perhaps, or the way in which certain things affect the world as an entirety. So, for example, the ones that I teach on this are global crime. How do we develop international criminality? Another one that I teach is on the importance of migration, not just emigration and immigration, but also internal migration. So that's the sort of broad brush history that we cover in world history. And the other optional module that is worth mentioning here is the research skills module, which really takes the ideas of what do we use as our sources, how do we use them, how do we utilize digital resources, how can you get the best results from digitized sources, how do you operate in an archive? I mean, there is a certain etiquette, there is a certain way of actually analysing information in an archive. So these are very, very important skills that are vital to develop, and they will hopefully enable, as I said before, this skill to be developed from the analysis of raw data right through to the communication of that in coherent arguments. Year 2 has more choice. There are compulsory modules. Either you continue with the public history strand, if that's what you decide interests you, or you go into a strand that looks more at perspectives. How do we utilize sources? And you're given a major project of I think it's 6,500 words now, in which you take about 10 sources and do a thorough analysis on those. And these will be knitted together in a particular theme. So, for example, one of the students I've been speaking to recently was doing hers on the Great Smog of London and how this has affected environmental policy since then. So she'll take a variety of sources and analyse that particular question using those sources. But you really have a lot more freedom of choice in the second year too. And we have optional modules that are pretty wide-ranging. For example, in the second year, I teach two options, one of which is American slavery since abolition. So, how have we arrived at a situation where in 2000 America has to pass major anti-slavery legislation? And we'll look at all sorts of things in that. We look at the re-enslavement through convict leasing, right up to enslavement by the algorithm. So, very wide-ranging course there. The other one that I teach is a reanalysis of organised crime in American history. So we look at things like the mafia and the mafia's evolution. We look at Chinese tongs. We look at all sorts of types of organised crime, but we also take a much more measured view of where organised crime is really based on reality and where it is actually just perhaps moral panic and hype. Those are the ones that I teach, but I mean, there are a variety of all sorts of different modules that are run, from social history of early modern Britain right through to ideas of the occult in Victorian Britain, rock art in post-colonial nations. And I don't mean by that, I don't mean sort of pictures on downloads of heavy metal music. I mean more sort of indigenous art and how that fits in with archaeology and post-colonialism. So the variety is pretty impressive, not just geographically, but also across time and the themes that we deal with. In your third and final year, your work will centre around the only compulsory element that you have, which is your dissertation. Now, this can be on absolutely anything, and the range of topics that we've had for dissertations is pretty staggering, really. I think my favourite dissertation that I marked was one that was done on the disco revolution, so how disco music has actually affected not just popular culture, but also the entire political system of Europe and the United States. But that is just one particular one that I thought was very good. I also had an extraordinary dissertation which was done on what was called the dead man's hand, which was one particular hand that can be dealt in a poker game, and the influence of that on the American West. An extraordinary piece of work. So you can see that the way in which dissertations can be carried out, as long as you feel that you can actually find good enough sources to be able to put these together, and as long as the person that you go to actually act as your tutor on this feels that they have sufficient knowledge of the subject, it's pretty well anything you like, actually. But throughout most of the third year, you are doing optional modules. Now, you can see from the list that's there that there's a very, very wide variety of modules that we offer. The only one that I offer that I can speak to is the Three Clans, which is looking at the evolution and the history of the Ku Klux Klan, which always seems pretty popular, and it's a course that really is, again, trying to dismantle preconceptions and perhaps put together different interpretations. But you can see that the range of courses that we run in the third year is extremely wide-ranging. So far, we've been addressing single honours history, but it's also possible to study in very different ways. If you choose to take combined honours modules, then your compulsory modules and your optional modules are different. I'm not going to run through all these, but you can see that the way that the years are put together is slightly different. But that's something that really is probably best to discuss with someone who's a specialist in these things. Another element that we are very pleased to be able to offer nowadays is the language modules, which can actually be taken as a part of your degree. So at present we offer Mandarin, Spanish, French at beginner or intermediate levels. German module is also running as an advanced only module. And the way in which this works is that if you complete a minimum of 60 credits in any particular language, you'll be able to claim that your degree is history with a proficiency in Spanish, French, German. And that becomes a part of your actual degree title. So it's well worth doing. I mean, I personally regret that I didn't study languages earlier, and I did actually spend 10 years studying Russian, and I found it absolutely vital. Even though I wanted to become a Russian historian and ended up becoming an American historian, that use of that language, the insight that it gives you into another culture is fantastic. One of the great opportunities that Penryn offers is the ability to spend a year studying abroad. Now, you can do this in one of two ways. You can either sign up for a degree with study abroad programs initially, so that's what you actually apply for in the first place, or you can decide at any point during your first year that you want to study your second year abroad. I mean, there is a cut-off point. You would have to talk to the study abroad team about this. But there are advantages of both. I mean, firstly, if you decide that you just want to do a straightforward 3-year degree initially, then obviously you know exactly what your degree is going to be. If you decide to change, then you do have some disadvantages in as much as you may not have the breadth of choice that's available to those people that book initially. Now, if you're extending your degree by studying abroad for a year to a 4-year degree, that doesn't necessarily mean that your tuition fees are going to jump through the roof. That year that you spend abroad, you spend nothing on the tuition fees for the host institution, but you pay 15% of what would be your normal tuition fees, provided you're a home tuition fee student. That's all you pay. So you pay 3 years at 9,250, is it, and the other year at 15% of that. My maths won't allow me to do that. So if you have a look at the universities that we have links with, they are in 4 main continents, and they're good, high-level institutions. I certainly recommend taking up this opportunity, or I certainly recommend having a chat with the study abroad team. It's also possible to spend your second year either studying for a work placement or a placement as part of your degree. This employment experience program is developed to make sure that you gain far better employability and interpersonal skills than you might perhaps by just staying on the university campus. This again there's a specialist team who deal with this, and I would definitely recommend talking to them. But it also, like the study abroad program, doesn't mean that your 4-year degree program will necessarily cost you the full 4 years tuition fees if you are a home-based student. It's also worth noting that we have a great deal of emphasis on support, pastoral care for our students. As you can see, there's a lot of academic support, which will enable you to improve your writing skills, maybe learn more about what resources are available in the library, perhaps air your views about what you feel is going particularly well or what you feel isn't so good in the staff-student liaison committee. We also pride ourselves on a very personal, very approachable attitude amongst our staff. We have personal tutoring, which is vital to the entire support for our students throughout all years of their time at Exeter. But also, we are very keen on the idea that any grades that you get back, which perhaps you don't understand why you didn't get the grade that you thought you might do, or what you were doing right and where you can go to follow this on, are dealt with in office hours and feedback hours that are one-to-one personal tuition. Now, the other thing is that there is a very, very highly developed well-being aspect to our university life now. The university is, of course, accessible to anyone of different abilities. Also, we have mental and physical health well-being services, and there is a student health centre. Should you decide that you really want to open up your heart to someone, then there is a counselling program available. All these are a part of your normal university life. Now, I realise that we've covered an almighty amount of ground and that there's a lot that you perhaps would like to know more about. There's a lot perhaps that you might want clarification on. Now, you can now talk to students and a member of staff to actually see what really studying in Exeter Penryn is like. Thank you very much, and I look forward to teaching you next year. Thank you. Bye-bye.